Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this little video that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video by that of the boxing channel that I like to review here and there, known as Dante's Boxing Nation. And of course, Dante's Boxing Nation, he's going to talk about his favorite fighter, Mr. Canelo Alvarez. And we know that he's been trying to tear down Canelo Alvarez for the better part of 10 years. But Canelo Alvarez and his career, it is going to be very interesting these next few years because I do fully believe that it is, kind of coming close to that end of his career. Now, of course, Canelo stated, I believe recently, that he plans to fight a little bit longer, that he plans to fight about 4 to 5 more years. Which is still quite a long time. I'm not quite sure if his career is going to last that much longer, and the reason why I say that is because you have a lot of great contenders out there. Not even just Charlo or Andre, but David Benavidez and, Jamel Charlo. Even though I expect Canelo to beat Jamel Charlo, you don't know how much that could possibly take out of him. Because in my personal view, Canelo Alvarez, he clearly is about a level, maybe even 2 levels below what he once was. The last truly great performance that I seen Canelo Alvarez have in a fight when I thought that he looked like an A plus to S tier level fighter, I thought was against Caleb Plant. Now against Gennady Golovkin, he still looked, relatively good to borderline great, but there were still some problems that I seen in that fight. And in the John Ryder fight, in my view, he clearly did not look like the same fighter at all. Now, it could have just been that John Ryder, he was a pressure fighter, and at times those fighters have given Canelo a little bit of problems, not necessarily with any chance of really majorly beating him, at least when they don't have a great amount of technique, or I'm not going to say technique, but a great game plan or a great skill set behind it. But at the end of the day, he did give Canelo Alvarez a lot of problems. He was very hittable in that fight. I thought that Canelo Alvarez looked a little bit sluggish and a little bit lethargic. I thought that he looked slow. I thought that it was very clear that his athleticism, at least in my personal view, that it is starting to wane a little bit. It just is what it is. But anyways, apparently Canelo Alvarez, apparently he recently stated, because a lot of people have been asking him about the potentiality of there being a Terence Bud Crawford fight. He stated that it may possibly happen if it makes sense. And this would be a very interesting fight. I've kind of already talked about it a couple of times. I don't quite know if I would recommend this fight really for that of Terence Bud Crawford. Now, the interesting thing about this fight is that when you actually take a look at Canelo Alvarez, I don't think a lot of people actually realize how short Canelo Alvarez is for that of a quote-unquote super middleweight or even a middleweight fighter. Canelo Alvarez is only 5'8", and when you take a look at him compared to Mayweather, he's right there with Floyd Mayweather Jr., and Mayweather is a legit 5'8" when you compare the sizes to him and other fighters. He's also a guy that only has a 71 or 72-inch arm reach. I think it's around 71 to 71 and a half inches. So this would be a very particularly interesting fight because Terence Bud Crawford, even though clearly he would not have the size advantage in the fight, he would have the reach advantage over Canelo Alvarez, probably possibly by a few inches. He would have the faster and the better feet than Canelo Alvarez. It would be very interesting to see what Terence Bud Crawford would be able to do to Canelo Alvarez and what answers Canelo would have for Terence Bud Crawford as well. Because if there is a certain fighter that would have beaten Canelo Alvarez, even at his best, at least a type of style, it would have been that Terence Bud Crawford style, a fighter that really would have had probably the better and quicker feet, a guy that can fight elite on the front foot and the back foot, someone like that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. But unfortunately, Terence might be a little bit too small compared to that of Canelo Alvarez. And on top of that, there also is certain factors that Canelo Alvarez, at least at his best, that he does do a little bit better than Terence Bud Crawford as well. At his best, I think that he's the slightly better defensive fighter. I think even at times that you can argue that he has the slightly better head movement because it's no offense against Terence, but other than that of the Errol Spence Jr. fight, I've never really seen a stellar defensive performance from that of Terence Bud Crawford. Other than that of the Errol Spence Jr. fight, but maybe that's just me. Because in a lot of his other fights, whether you want to talk about the Gamboa fight or the Hank Lundy fight, or even the Jose Benavidez fight, whatever fight you want to talk about, where the fighter was actually able to land a certain amount of punches or showed slight competitiveness in the fight, Terence Bud Crawford got caught with several good blows in all those fights. The Sean Porter fight, Kell Brook, even though Kell Brook was pretty much done and washed up at that point in time in his career, but it is what it is. But both of these fighters, in my view, they clearly are the greatest or the best fighters within that of the past 10 years in terms of the late 2010s to the early 2020s decade of that of boxing. And of course, there was a multitude of other great fighters as well, like that of Vasily Lomachenko, Gennady Golovkin, Josh Taylor, and, I'm sure I'm missing some others, maybe even AJ Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder, or some other fighters, that I'm not mentioning that kind of just missed that mark of being in that same conversation. But I think that when you talk about the 2 or 3 fighters that are going to be remembered as the greatest fighters of that little era, I think Canelo Alvarez is going to come up. I think that Terence Bud Crawford's going to come up. I also believe that Tyson Fury is going to come up because I do believe, in my personal view, that more than likely that Tyson Fury is going to retire undefeated personally. But we'll see. Anyways, let's see what Dante's Boxing Nation has to say. Let's get straight into it.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So, just like Terence Crawford was on a mission to fight Errol Spence for like 5 years, he's now on a new mission, and that's to fight the winner of Canelo versus Jermell Charlo. About a week after Terence Crawford beat Errol Spence,
I really hope that the Jermell Charlo fight happens at 154 pounds, but I'm not too confident about it anymore because I don't think that Jermell Charlo was ever super stoked on fighting the winner of Errol Spence versus Terence Bud Crawford in the first place. I think that Jermell Charlo, he was planning and hoping that his buddy Errol Spence Jr. would win that fight, and he could say, well, I'm going to kind of let Errol Spence Jr. take over this weight division, so I'm going to move up to 160 pounds, kind of take over that weight division when my brother is now kind of not as much of a factor there anymore, and then we can kind of still remain friends, and then I don't have to take an alleged ass whooping against that of Errol Spence Jr. Just my personal view, but this is pretty much the worst nightmare for Jermell Charlo, and I don't think that he's fighting Canelo Alvarez. I don't think that in his mind that he truly believes that he can with 100% certainty beat Canelo Alvarez. That's not me saying that he's not coming here to win, but at the end of the day, just in my view, I think that Jermell Charlo is someone going on a suicide mission because in one weight division, you have a potential ass whooping against Terence Bud Crawford, and then in another weight division, you have a potential ass whooping, against Canelo Alvarez. Now, he could have moved up to 160, but it would have looked bad had he not fought Terence Bud Crawford, especially with that of the bad blood. So this kind of gives an excuse to that of Jermell Charlo if he does lose to Terence Bud Crawford or possibly not even fighting him, just so we can say, oh, well, I can't make the weight anymore. But the LDBC and new media, they're not going to say that about Jermell Charlo. Now, apparently Jermell Charlo has stated that he's still willing to go back down to 154 and fight that of Terence Bud Crawford. Do I believe that? I'm not so sure. We'll have to see.
Jermell Charlo, he came out and he said that he'd be willing to go back down to 154 and fight against Terence Crawford. But more recently, he's now saying he doesn't know if he will ever go back down to 154. But that's no problem because Terence Crawford...
Which is very unfortunate because that would have been a blockbuster fight. And when you talk about the 154-pound weight division, and this is what I mean about the 154-pound weight division, so many of these LDBC and new media channels, that claim that 154 pounds was the deepest division in boxing and all this other bullshit. Now that Jermell Charlo is out of that weight division, how much money you want to bet that none of these LDBC or new media channels talk about that weak-ass weight division whatsoever? No one gives a shit about Brian Gastano or Tony Harrison or Erickson Lubin or Tim Tszyu. No one gives a shit. If Tim Tszyu became the unified champion of 154 pounds today, I guarantee you that they may not even put him on their top 10 pound per pound list because no one is at 154 that is truly a great fighter. It is what it is. That division is filled with B and C grade level talent, period.
Now is willing to go all the way up to 168. But Jermell Charlo said that he...
So once again, let's see if Tim Tszyu, when he unifies that weight division, let's see, and also he has the potential to become undefeated in that weight division as well, because Jermell Charlo should have lost 1 or 2 fights in that weight division. He lost to Tony Harrison, and he should have lost that first fight to Brian Gastano, even though it was competitive in both fights. But when it comes down to it, once again, let's see if Tim Tszyu, if he becomes undisputed in that weight division. I doubt it because I think more than likely Terence is going to be going for that weight division, and I would not favor any fighter at 154 to beat Terence Bud Crawford more than likely. but it would be very interesting. Let's see if Tim Tszyu becomes undisputed before possibly Terence Bud Crawford gets there. Let's see if they put him in the top 10 pound for pound or the top 5. Let's see.
But also go after David Benavidez after the Canelo Alvarez fight. And I truly believe that Jermell Charlo, he feels that a David Benavidez fight will be easier than a Terence Crawford fight, regardless of the fact that Terence Crawford is moving up 3 weight classes or 2 weight classes. And I say 2 weight classes.
I'll say this. I think that Jermell Charlo, I think that he might think that taking an ass whooping to David Benavidez would be easier than taking an ass whooping to Terence Bud Crawford. That's why I say, after this Canelo fight, whether he wins or loses, I expect him to lose, but you never know in boxing. And plus, Canelo, once again, does not look quite like the same fighter to me, although I still would give him a 70% chance to win the fight, meaning so would Canelo Alvarez, of course. But, once again, you never know in terms of boxing, excuse me. And, we'll see what happens. But it's going to be very interesting if Jermell Charlo, whether he wins or loses that fight, if he's going to go back down to 154. Going to be very interesting because we know what the narratives would be if it were Canelo or another one of these fighters that they don't like.
It's because there's a good chance that Jermell Charlo may go down to 160 after the Canelo Alvarez fight. This just means the fights are going to get bigger and bigger. Even when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, because Canelo Alvarez is now with Al Heyman is going to put him in the biggest fights, regardless if it's against welterweights or super middleweights. It's no different than Manny Pacquiao when he made his move from Top Rank to PBC. We seen him fight Adrian Broner, Keith Thurman, and he was supposed to fight Errol Spence until Errol Spence had to pull out. As long as Canelo Alvarez is fighting on PBC, I don't think we're going to see him fighting against any more Yodirams or John Ryders. When it comes to DAZN, I think the main reason why...
Once again, isn't it interesting that whenever he talks about the opponents that Canelo Alvarez fought that were alleged bums, he never brings up Callum Smith or Billy Joe Saunders or Caleb Plant in those conversations. You know why that is? Because Dante's Boxing Nation knows deep down, even with all the bullshit that he tries to promote, that all those guys were somewhat of legitimate champions. Now, is that me saying that Caleb Plant is an A-plus level champion? No, but at the end of the day, he was a guy that was a very decently talented 168-pounder. And these were the same guys that at one point in time were claiming that Canelo Alvarez was allegedly avoiding that of Caleb Plant. And then he fought him, and what happened? Oh, well, he breaks down. He's a guy that, clearly doesn't have the skill set to compete with Canelo Alvarez. At one point in time, they're also calling him to fight Callum Smith. Now, Callum Smith, once again, he's a little bit of that stiff British fighter type of build. But at the end of the day, he is a guy that won the, I believe, little super series at the 168-pound weight division. He did have the Ring Magazine title. So it's not like he's just a complete washover like that of Liam Smith. He is at least somewhat of a caliber opponent. He's probably along the A- level, somewhere around there, especially because he's pretty much a natural light heavyweight. So, I always gave Canelo a bit of credit, with that win. And then, of course, you're talking about Billy Joe Saunders. Now, Billy Joe Saunders, of course, he's not necessarily the most powerful guy. He's not a super-duper great puncher. But at the end of the day, he is a guy that's a very swift fighter, very slick. And he's a decently intelligent boxer. That's why at one point in time, remember, Dante and a lot of these guys, when Demetrius Andrade and Billy Joe Saunders was about to happen, they were calling it one of the biggest fights in boxing. Not of the middleweight division, not of just that division or the biggest fight of Andrade's career. They were calling it one of the biggest fights in boxing. Now, those are their words, okay? Their words.
Canelo Alvarez.
Then as soon as Canelo Alvarez fights him, what happens? Oh, he's not fighting him at the same point in time in his career. Oh, he's avoiding this guy. Oh, he's avoiding that guy. Oh, that's our bullshit.
Left his own.
And that's not me saying that Canelo Alvarez, that I would not love to see the Jermell Charlo and Andrade and David Benavidez fights. But let's give credit where credit is due, especially when at one point in time, these opponents you claimed were dangerous contenders for Canelo or other people. And then as soon as Canelo Alvarez fights them, all of a sudden they're not anything? That doesn't make any sense.
Because the only fighter they were really...
Now, Terence Bud Crawford has apparently dealt with a similar situation, but the problem is with Terence Bud Crawford's opponents is that anyone with a logical mind knew that the majority of those opponents were B and C grade level fighters. Canelo Alvarez is actually fighting some debatable A- level contenders. They just weren't A+. But Terence Bud Crawford, with Aegis Velasquez and Jose Benavidez and Julius Ndango and Victor Postal, Like, besides maybe Postal, none of those guys are A-grade level fighters. It just is what it is.
Offering him to fight was Dimitri Bivol. And Canelo Alvarez, he knew he wasn't going to beat Bivol in a rematch. And for a fighter on Canelo Alvarez level, to lose to the same fighter twice would be extremely detrimental to his career. So moving to PBC was an absolute no-brainer. And even though Canelo Alvarez hasn't even got past Jermell Charlo yet, and he might not get past him, assuming he does, reporters are all asking Canelo Alvarez about him fighting against Crawford, because once again, Crawford has said that he wants to go up to 168 and fight either Canelo Alvarez or Jermell Charlo, depending on who wins that fight. But Canelo is not showing too much interest in the Terence Crawford fight. And it's interesting because when Terence Crawford said that he'd be willing to move up to 158 or 160, Canelo Alvarez said he'd be really interested in that fight at 168. He said he would not go down below 168. Now that Terence Crawford is insisting to go to 168, Canelo Alvarez is saying this.
I respect Crawford. He's a great fighter. And I always say that, no disrespect to him. But,
Let me also give Canelo Alvarez a lot of credit, because Canelo Alvarez is a boxing savant. He is a great boxing intellect. He was one of the guys that predicted from the get-go that Terence Bud Crawford would beat that of Errol Spence Jr. Canelo Alvarez, you can tell, is a student of the game and that he is a highly intelligent fighter. Like I said, I don't think a lot of people realize that it's one thing when Terence Bud Crawford, when he's pretty much a natural welterweight build, when he gets titles from 135 to 147, and by no means am I trying to diminish his accomplishments, but a lot of those guys that he was fighting at 135 to 140, first of all, were not really on his level in terms of talent when it came down to it, but on top of that, he pretty much outreached them and he was bigger than them, at least a certain amount of them. Canelo Alvarez is moving up to 160, 168, and at times 175 with a 5'8" frame and a 71-inch arm reach, and he's outboxing guys like Caleb Plant and Danny Jacobs, and even gave Dimitri Bivol the toughest fight of his career. That's why I say, like, Canelo Alvarez, these people, they can say whatever they want to, but his resume speaks for itself.
Sometimes it's a little crazy that people talking about I'm gonna face a small fighter like Charlo. He's big, which he is big, and everybody's talking about if I'm gonna face Crawford, fighter 147, who is smaller than Charlo. So no make sense when you guys say that right now. I don't understand, right? Because you're talking about I take Charlo, he's 2 weight classes lower than me, and then you're talking about Crawford,
And let me also state this. Canelo Alvarez, what he stated in that video was that he said, I don't understand why people want me to fight a fighter that's 2 weight classes lower than me. And Canelo Alvarez has already stated this, and he's absolutely correct about if he beats Terence Bud Crawford, he's not going to get much credit for it anyway. We all know what these channels are going to say, that, oh, well, he did have the size advantage and blah, blah, blah. So it's pretty much going to get reduced to null and void anyway. And then on top of that, if he beats Canelo Alvarez, it's just going to look all that much worse. So, for Canelo Alvarez, if you're in his, position, at least at the current moment, there's not really a great reason to fight that of Terence Bud Crawford unless you think that it's absolutely necessary or absolutely have to. Now, it is a great fight, but there is other fights out there ready for Canelo Alvarez. Both Charlo brothers, the Demetrius Andrade fight, the David Benavidez fight, and I believe more than likely that Canelo Alvarez, that he's more than likely going to try to get those fighters out of the way first. And Jermell Charlo, because they're going to bring up the point, well, he's clearly avoiding Crawford, because, Charlo is clearly smaller than Canelo as well, and he doesn't have a problem with fighting him. Well, the thing is this. Canelo and Charlo is not as much of a size advantage in favor of Canelo Alvarez as what people are really trying to pretend that it is. And don't get me wrong, Charlo, I'm not saying that he's bigger than Canelo Alvarez, but he's lengthy, he's tall when it comes down to it, and on top of that, it's pretty much like a middleweight versus that of a 154-pounder. Or really, if we want to go there, one could argue that this is pretty much a fight between two middleweights. because Canelo Alvarez is not a natural 168 pounder. He's more accustomed to the weight class now because he's been in the upper weight classes for so long, but he's not a natural 168 pounder. He never has been, and Jermell Charlo could easily be fighting at the middleweight division. So this really is a fight that, yeah, Canelo's going to have a little bit of the size advantage, but it's nowhere near as massive as what a certain amount of these people are trying to allege. The Terence Bud Crawford and Canelo size advantage would be a massive advantage for Canelo Alvarez, because Terence has never fought at 154 or 160 before.
And this and that.
And I'm not sure if Jermell Charlo has either, but he at least has the type of build to fight there. Terence Bud Crawford, he has the reach, to kind of fight there, but he doesn't look like a guy that is really anything above a 147 pounder in terms of thickness. I think that, he can handle himself at 154 and can handle himself at 160 somewhat. But do I think that he's naturally built for those weight divisions? No. Charlo, you could argue, is naturally built, debatably, for a 160-pound weight division.
At the end of the day, I don't want to have credit to face Crawford, right? So no matter what, but you never know. You never know in boxing.
Absolutely.
I'll go up and down and fight everybody out there. So it's possible. Why not? It's possible.
Okay, so this is an interview that Canelo Alvarez did with Fight Hype, and what you will notice is Canelo Alvarez right there, he never said that he wants that fight. So the reporter, he decided to defend Canelo Alvarez and tried to force Canelo Alvarez to say that he would be interested some kind of way in fighting Terence Crawford.
Why not?
You're a businessman, Canelo. I'm sure if it makes business sense, you'll.
It makes sense. I'm down. Do it. I don't care who is there. I'm always.
And this is how you can tell, once again, when it comes to channels, who's a true hater of someone, because the fighter or the athlete in question, they can never win no matter the standards. And that's the thing with Canelo Alvarez. He can never win with any of these guys. If he fights Terence Bud Crawford, he's fighting a guy that's 2 weight classes lower. Oh, of course he's going to fight Terence Bud Crawford. But if he doesn't take the fight, oh, well then why are you facing Jermell Charlo? But once again, if he faces Terence Bud Crawford, oh, well, fight Andrade, fight Charlo. Why are you fighting him? So once again, Canelo is never in a winning side when it comes to these guys. And that's the difference between, once again, someone who's an objective commentator versus a hater. That's the difference, because a hater will always change the finish line. They'll always put the distance a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further, because their goal is to make sure that you never get their respect, or that you never reach that goal that they allegedly want you to attain. When really what a hater just wants you to do is that they just want you to pretty much die off and disappear. A logical and objective commentator, they just want to see if you can cross the finish line.
Able to fight anybody.
See, here's the thing. When Canelo Alvarez says, people are going to say that he's too small, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when Canelo Alvarez was fighting against Amir Khan, when Canelo was fighting against Josito Lopez, that's when he was supposed to say, I'm not going to fight those guys because I will get no credit for it. But he was all in.
Right, but this is a different type of situation, Dante. Terence Bud Crawford is one of the best fighters in the world. And the way that Canelo Alvarez looks at it is that if I fight him and if I potentially beat him, people are basically just going to say that, oh, well, I was way too big and I'm not going to get any credit for it anyway. And if he ends up beating me, which is possible, because Terence Bud Crawford, even though he would not have the size or weight advantage over me, at least in terms of the weight, if he beats me, then it's going to look that much more worse on me. So what really is in it for me? Unless, I've already beaten a couple of these other fighters, and there's just nothing left for either of us to attain other than that of facing each other and creating the biggest fight in all of boxing. When he fought Amir Khan and when he fought that of Josito Lopez, that was in more of the build-up for that of other fights. Terence Bud Crawford would have to be a fight that both fighters would have to very much mentally and physically prepare for.
When it came to fighting them.
And I think that Canelo Alvarez, that he's willing to fight Terence Bud Crawford, but I think that, as he said, that it's going to have to make sense. Why the hell would you want to fight him now, once again, when you have other contenders out there? And on top of that, to Terence Bud Crawford, there's just no major reason in terms of fighting him right now. I mean, Some people may say, well, he's a big name right now. He's, the new big fish in all the boxing. And that's true. He potentially, could be one of the bigger fights in all of boxing. But David Benavidez is still around, and I think that Canelo has plans for that. I think that if he does fight Terence Bud Crawford, it could happen right after that of the Jermell Charlo fight. It could, if he ends up winning against that of Jermell Charlo. But I believe more than likely he's going to go more in the direction of Jermell Charlo and David Benavidez, more than likely.
Now that it comes to Terence Crawford, he's saying he will be criticized and people will say that Terence Crawford is too small. But the problem with him saying that is Canelo Alvarez, he already knows that a lot of people would be picking Terence Crawford to beat him, which is more of an incentive to take the fight. Oscar De La Hoya himself, not only does he believe Crawford beats Canelo Alvarez, but he also believes Crawford would make that fight look very easy.
Well, it's no offense against Oscar De La Hoya with his coked up ass, but everything that he says about Canelo Alvarez, you have to take with a grain of salt, and you have to put context behind it, because ever since they've had a falling out, Oscar has done his best to try and try to dispatch of Canelo Alvarez's achievements and accomplishments. So I don't really trust anything that Oscar De La Hoya says. That's like Bob Arum talking on Floyd Mayweather or Mikey Garcia. Like, come on.
And I completely agree with Oscar. Because Terence Crawford, he showed in the Errol Spence fight. It doesn't matter if you're bigger than him. It doesn't matter if you have more power than him. He's not going to get hit.
Well, the problem with Errol Spence Jr. is that he was just so slow compared to that of Terence Bud Crawford in the fight. And there's just certain matchups that end up happening that afterwards you're like, you know what? Even though it looked like a 50-50 fight, that pretty much was the perfect type of style to beat that fighter. And for an all-time great fighter, or I can't call Errol Spence an all-time great fighter after that ass whooping that he took, but for an alleged great fighter, Terence Bud Crawford is pretty much the perfect type of style to beat Errol Spence. If you created a fighter in a lab to beat that of Errol Spence Jr. and be better than him in pretty much every category, it would be that of Terence Bud Crawford. Greater reach, greater hand speed, better and quicker feet, a guy that has better head movement. And he even had better defense in the fight than Errol Spence Jr. I already said this. If Terence Bud Crawford and his power, if he showed that he was able to push Errol Spence Jr. in that fight, and he was able to compete with him mano a mano, and he was able to hurt him and push him back, that fight was over. Because there was no other advantages other than a little bit of the size, the power, the chin, and, supposedly the defense that Errol Spence Jr. had. There was not one category, not one, that Errol Spence beat Terence Bud Crawford, and maybe an inch or two in terms of height. That was about it. Every other category, Terence Bud Crawford beat him in. Every other category, and it wasn't even close.
With those punches. In fact, Canelo Alvarez will most likely be slower than Errol Spence was, because he's much bigger than Errol Spence, and Canelo Alvarez has...
I'm not quite sure if he'd be slower than Errol Spence. Errol Spence, and he's never been, like as slow as molasses in my view, but he's never been quick either. But Canelo Alvarez is a better all-around fighter than Errol Spence. It would be a very interesting fight because he has better head movement than Errol Spence Jr. He has better defense. He has more multiplicity in his style, or he has a little bit more multi-dimensions. He's a much better counterpuncher than that of Errol Spence Jr. He will throw feints. He has a great jab. So like I said, even Canelo at this point in time, he's a lot like Oscar De La Hoya at that latter part of his career when he was fighting Floyd Mayweather Jr. He's not the same fighter that he once was, but he's still very dangerous.
Never been known for his hand speed. He's not a Roy Jones Jr. And
Well, Canelo used to be known for pretty decent hand speed, but he does not any longer have that type of hand speed. That's the first thing that I noticed that started to wane a little bit with Canelo Alvarez. He no longer has that type of hand speed. His hands, I'm not going to say they're slow, but they're nowhere near what they once were.
Doesn't even throw punches in bunches. Canelo usually relies on one or two hard counter shots or lead shots. So just think of how difficult it would be for Canelo Alvarez to rely on landing one of those hard shots. And I'm talking about one of them. Terence Crawford would be an absolute nightmare for Canelo Alvarez. And I truly believe Canelo Alvarez, he sees a Terence Crawford fight as a more difficult fight than the Jermell Charlo fight. Every time he talks...
I think there's a very high potential of that, and it's no offense against Jermell Charlo, but Jermell Charlo, once again, the reason why he's been getting all these belts and all this other stuff, That's because in that division, there's just nobody there. And I'm sorry, but Brian Castano, he's a good little fighter. He's not great. Tony Harrison, he's okay. He's not great. Tim Tszyu, he even appears just good. I don't think he's great. Like, none of those fighters there are on Jamel Charlo's level. It just is what it is. Like, he's almost like the Max Holloway of boxing. Where Max Holloway, I always stated this, and a lot of MMA fans, who the majority of the time, if we're being real, are about as dumb as rocks. They mainly disagree with me because they're like, oh, Max Holloway, what are you talking about? He beat all these guys like Ricardo Lamas and Brian Ortega and Yair Rodriguez and blah, blah, blah. All these top contenders, right? But none of those contenders can compete with Max Holloway. That's why whenever Max Holloway, when he could finally fight a guy that could actually compete with his size and a guy that was actually A-grade caliber and a guy that was a championship level fighter, he lost. He lost to Volkanovski. He lost to Conor McGregor. He lost to Dustin Poirier twice. So at the end of the day, there's a reason overall why Jamel Charlo looks so shitty against Brian Castano in the first fight and against Tony Harrison. That's why I don't predict him to beat Canelo Alvarez, even though Canelo, he's starting to fade a little bit, because it's no offense against Jamel Charlo, but if he is on the top 10 pound per pound list, he's the most limited top 10 pound per pound fighter there.
Talks about Terence Crawford, he always starts off saying, I have a lot of respect for Crawford. He's a great fighter. Canelo Alvarez is extremely impressed with what he's seen Terence Crawford do to Errol Spence. Extremely impressed. And I believe not only would Terence Crawford beat Canelo Alvarez, but there's a very good chance he would stop him. Because
I wouldn't favor Terence Bud Crawford to stop Canelo. To be honest with you, for someone to stop Canelo Alvarez, he would either have to be pretty much done within his career, or it would have to be almost like a light heavyweight type of fighter. Canelo Alvarez has one of the greatest chins in boxing that I've ever seen. Even when Dimitri Bivol, and if you hear reports on how hard Dimitri Bivol punches, I have some of these guys in my comment section every once in a while, and they're like, oh, well, Dimitri Bivol doesn't have that many knockouts. You can't go, how much punching power someone has just because of how many knockouts they have, because of their type of style. Dimitri Bivol, and this is according to certain reports by David Benavidez and other fighters, he has the same level of punching power as Gennady Golovkin. And Dimitri Bivol was teeing off on Canelo Alvarez in some of those rounds because he had no stamina. And Canelo was still able to avoid some of those shots and pretty much swallow those punches. Canelo has probably, if we're going to go there, one of the top 5 chins in boxing when you talk about for a championship level fighter, for one of the greater fighters of all time. Him, Marvin Hagler, possibly Gennady Golovkin, Floyd Mayweather, all those fighters are up there.
Alvarez, he throws every single punch the same. He throws it with the exact same velocity, which is why we've seen Canelo Alvarez get tired.
Well, he used to do that a little bit early on in his career, but he changed that up, which is why he was so successful, even against that of bigger fighters. But Dante really doesn't know what the hell he's watching. Once again, Dante is another one of these guys that, he takes a look at boxing and he really doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. That's why even if he gets his fight prediction correct, the fight usually a lot of the times to him looks a little bit different than what he expected because he doesn't really know how to break down a fight.
When he was fighting against Bivol, because Bivol used Canelo Alvarez's power against him. He would stand close to Canelo and he would allow Canelo to basically punch himself out. And as soon as Canelo Alvarez was expecting to get a breather, that's when Bivol would jump on him with combinations.
Well, Bivol did a very good job of countering Canelo Alvarez and also showing Canelo that he wasn't just going to allow him to run through him. But on top of that, Canelo Alvarez's stamina was done after round 4. He had no stamina after round 4. He was backing up the whole entire time. He was completely gassed.
And I believe Terence Crawford could do something similar to that. If that fight ever happened, the second half of that fight would be a complete nightmare for Canelo Alvarez. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next. Let me tell you guys about East.
But we'll see about that. Do I believe that Dante truly believes 100% what he's saying? Probably not, but these LDBC and new media guys, a lot of them are full of shit, and they just say the things that they say in order to hype something up and get views. So it is what it is. But I would love to see that fight, because I will say this. If Terence Bud Crawford somehow did end up defeating Canelo Alvarez, I'm going to be shell-shocked. I'd probably be slightly surprised just because Canelo, he's probably around just as skilled as Terence Bud Crawford, at his best. And on top of that, he would be clearly girthier. But Terence Bud Crawford would be just as tall as him. And on top of that, he'd be more lengthier than him. And he would have the hand speed, probably at this point in time in his career, over Canelo. And on top of that, he certainly would have the feet over Canelo. So it would be a very interesting fight. Very interesting fight indeed. But anyways, Canelo, of course, has Jermell Charlo ahead of him. That would be a very interesting fight as well. We'll see how good he looks in that fight. I still predict, he'll look good in that fight, but not great. So we'll see. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.